So I don't have much behind-the-scenes stuff to talk about in this episode, but I will say this. Apparently this was designed as a post-Cold War analogy thing for the number of then-reported nuclear missiles, which were basically unaccounted for in the former Soviet Union. I gotta be honest, I don't really see it. I'd also like to say that this feels a little more typical Voyager. In other words, things like logic or reason take a backseat to whatever they need the plot to happen. There's a lot of examples of bad writing in this episode. I'm only going to cover them in brief because I've talked about most of these concepts before. But there is one thing I really want to talk about, and I'm just going to jump right into it. Didn't we already have a missile that was so ridiculously, incredibly, insanely complicated and powerful that was turned into a bomb? Remember that episode? It was a Cardassian missile, and by missile, of course, I mean fully functioned warship that could take on the Voyager, an Intrepid-class ship, and win. And that's actually exactly what happens in this episode, too, just a little bit differently. This thing is so stupidly advanced that it resists Borg assimilation effectively. I mean, I know that's not literally what's doing. I'm exaggerating for effect. So to bring it back to reality land, this thing is implanted with nanites and retaliates in a way that causes Seven to need weeks of regeneration to recover from it. Seriously. This is a thing that completely takes over half the ship and has a ridiculous detonation power and its own warp drive and a fully sapient sentient AI, which is so intelligent it doesn't even understand that it's not actually a person at first, which, by the way, I'm also calling out in bad writing, but we'll get to that in a minute. And can think and navigate and do, and it's a bomb. It's a freaking bomb. Now, I get the point of smart bombs. I do. But this is a little ridiculous. And again, we've already done this on Voyager. And, it's just, I get it. I get it. From a writing perspective, when you have a crew with access to all of the talents that Voyager does, in terms of technology, in terms of personnel, it's hard to come up with a dilemma that challenges them. I get that. I do. I've talked about it for the last several episodes now. But this is stupid. This is like saying... This is the writing equivalent of being back on the playground and having one of the kids show up and say, I've got invulnerable to everything shields, you can't hurt me. And no matter what you come up with, they just say, well, I've got a counter to that too. It's ridiculous. And it makes for cheap drama, and I'm kind of sick of it. That's all I'm going to say about that. I do want to mention the other bad writing thing. One of the ways that is bad writing is to try and add suspense by making it so that the audience doesn't guess the reality first. Basically, they don't fully know what's up, what's happening. And so they don't, to maintain the sense of suspense and, oh my gosh, what's going to go on. Very logical, right? And there's a lot of ways you can do that. One of the cheaper ways is to basically cheat narratively, to have something that shouldn't happen, but is only happening for the sake of the audience. This is a weird call-out on this one, but the movie Frozen actually did this. There's a scene where the villain has a cheap little moment where it makes it look like he's not the villain in sight of nobody. So there's no one for him to maintain his facade in front of, and yet he's still doing it for the sake of the audience and for no other reason. And this is a very common thing. It happens all over the place, but it's still bad writing. In this case, it's the, why am I not a person? Where are my arms and limbs? What do I look like? Kind of a thing. And yet, when the moment he goes into the doctor, all his memories are restored and he knows everything and everything's fine. And the previous thought of why this AI would ever think it was a person, completely abandoned. Now, I could extrapolate on that, but based on the construction of the rest of the episode, I'm not inclined to. I think it's just a plot device. We needed to get from point A to point B, so we did. The end. Whatever. This freaking missile. Now, one of the things I want to mention, though, is that Harry gives this little speech of the burdens of command to the ensign. And the stupid thing is that speech is smug and superior and kind of ridiculous, actually. He is literally watching in case something happens, and if something does, he calls the real people to actually come and make real command decisions. Now, yes, I know Harry is part of the officer track, and yes, I know that most of this episode's undercurrent theme is about intelligence and making choices. I get that. But that line just smacked of superior smugness, and I hated it. That being said, the theme about that intelligence actually is pretty good. I like that. I liked the idea that making choices and owning up to them is something you need to learn how to do. TNG also covered this cop topic, actually. And DS9 has as well. It is one of the most common elements of command. Learning to live with your own decisions, good or bad. And I like how that weaves into the weapons plot, and Harry is the one who actually reaches out and reaches the weapon intellectually by convincing him that he, as an intelligence, has to make a choice. That's his choice. Harry doesn't say you have to disarm. Harry doesn't say you need to do this. Harry says you have to make the decision. You have the facts in front of you. You have to decide. Go. And that's what actually gets the Warhead's attention and actually causes it to make its decision. I liked that. That was well done. I also want to say that this is probably the first time this has started to really bother me. This will get worse in the future. The Doctor is starting to get a little bit quick to pull the race card. There's a scene where the dangers of the creature are discussed. This is before they even bring it up to the ship, and the Doctor says, it just because it's an AI doesn't mean it's not, blah blah blah. But that's not the point being made. The point being made is it could be dangerous or it could be difficult or whatever, and that's the actual problem here, right? But the Doctor immediately draws out the race card and says, no, just because it's an AI doesn't mean it's not a person. Now, this is a very minor example of that, but I point it out because it'll be a recurring theme for the next 2 seasons. And, yeah, enough said on that. Now, that being said, one thing that the weapon reminds me of a lot, other than the obvious Mary Sue nature of it, is the golems in Dragon Age. The ones that are basically sentient, sapient people forged, molded, we never know the exact process, into these golems. So the person's still in there. Actually, I lied. We do know the exact process. They pour molten lyrium into their eyes and mouths. Anyways, point being, so there's still a person in that golem, but they're completely subservient to their programming, right? Makes me wonder if that's actually how they accomplished this particular level of sentience and sapience among these things. And like I was hinting at earlier, this probably could explain the whole why I thought it was a person thing. Again, I'm not inclined to give it that leeway because the episode in general is pretty poorly constructed, but it is food for thought. Because that is very much an allegory, isn't it? This people who were apparently sufficiently advanced to either turn people into weapons or just make stupidly, overpoweredly ridiculous Remanship weapons. Hundreds of them. I mean, only a smattering of them went off, and these ones could probably have destroyed the planet they're going after. But anyways, getting back to the point. These ridiculously advanced people, it would not be surprising to me if, based on the propaganda that we keep hearing spouted from the Warhead, that they were sufficiently desperate to take such measures, so that it's possible that the Warheads all used to be people. Unlikely, and again, I'm not willing to give it that, but it is just kind of an insight into this messed up nature of what war can do to a society. I want to give huge props to the writing of this episode in terms of dialogue. The construction's flimsy and the plot is stitched together, but the dialogue is actually quite smart and very well done. Kind of a typical Voyager thing, really. The character moments are what helps sell it, and why I still think this is a net positive episode, despite the ridiculous word. I'm sorry. I'll shut up about it, I swear. But the dialogue between the Doctor and the Warhead is great. I basically call it the R2-D2 effect, or just the R2 effect, if you prefer. In other words, it is a particular type of challenge to write dialogue when the audience can't hear half of it. Some people go a little bit into the ridiculous realm with that, with the person basically repeating some of the lines back so that the audience can hear them, or at least a semblance of them. So, ending some things as a question, that kind of a thing. Some people go a little bit too far the other way, so you have no idea what the hell's going on. It's harder to do than you'd think. You can't just write the dialogue and then erase half of it, because then you just have pieces of a dialogue. You have to do a specific method, and I don't know how to describe this properly, but you have to specifically make it so that the back and forth makes sense, even though the audience doesn't hear half of it, and then the half that they do hear is enough indicative to kind of showcase what the other half is, so you get a feel for it. It's a particular type of writing, and they do a good job of it in this episode. I also want to give huge props to Robert Picardo for his performance. This is not exactly the first time he has played a character on Voyager other than the Doctor, in this case playing the Warhead. He does a great job of it. Like, really, just a fantastic job of it. And it's funny, too, because he's basically playing the inverse of what he normally does. Normally, he is a doctor, sworn to do no harm, who is extremely intelligent and extremely advanced of an AI. Now he is playing a weapon of mass destruction with a fairly simple and a fairly basic level of AI. Yes, there is an AI. Yes, there is intelligence there. I would argue that. But relatively speaking, it is way less complex than what the Doctor's got going. And, of course, the obvious Warhead versus Doctor thing going on. He does a great job of it, though. He gets across all the right points. He shows anger at the right points, and then confusion, and then back to the default. And he just does it a really well job, and I wanted to give him huge props for that. I'm not going to talk about the Warhead, but it is a little silly to once again, for the 500th millionth time, to see Voyager, or rather the ship on Star Trek that we're watching, taken over by an alien menace of the week. Really? Leaving alone, and again, I'm not talking about the Warhead. I said I wouldn't. I actually do have to talk about the Warhead a little bit more, but not in the same tone that you're thinking. Before I get to that, I want to talk about another little plot hole that exists in this. So, the war ended 3 years ago, right? Now he got the shutdown code and was sent into a planet and didn't detonate, unlike his fellow who did detonate. The other warheads were too far to get the stand down code, and then hung around for 3 years doing nothing until they found him. And then they're, okay, we found him, now we can go blow up the thing. I'm sorry, that's a plot hole. That exists for the sake of the plot. It can be explained, it never is. And no effort is made to try and sink it in. It is something that just made me scratch my head. I also like the fact that when Harry makes his command decision towards the end, he says, "No time to explain, Captain. You have to trust me on this." Janeway says, "You got it." It's not literally what she says, but she is immediately on board with that. I liked that. It shows the trust in him that she should have in any of her command officers. If they said, "Do this, no time to explain." Because it's true. Sometimes there just isn't time to explain. And yeah, you need to be able to trust your command staff on moments like that. They may even be wrong, but if you don't show that trust, you're going to engender a really bad chain of command situation. So I like that. The last point I want to talk about is the paradox of the smart bomb. Like I said, I'm not going into the Warhead again, not literally, not specifically, but rather the idea of weapons that are too intelligent. This is a common trope in most of fiction in general, but also science fiction in particular. How many times has there been a story about we had to make a weapon, then we had to make it better, we had to make it smarter, we had to make it better, we had to make it smarter. It became too smart for us. It started thinking we were the enemy. Skynet, for God's sakes. Just to go back to a very well-known example, but this is a very common thing. This is even, in a way, parodied to the point of humor, both humorously and then played seriously in the movie The Incredibles. This is not an uncommon idea. I'm not calling it out on that, by the way. I'm not one of those people who's like, oh, I'm tired of saying the same thing. That's not my point. My point is, it is an interesting thought process, isn't it? When you reach the point where you need your weapons to be so intelligent that it becomes a blurred line as if they count as people or not, when do you cross the ethical and moral boundary there? When you are effectively sending off a sentient sapient being to suicide bomb an enemy installation, At what point do you feel like you have gone too far on that? Do you think it is no longer worth fighting? Or is there such a point, depending on the enemy you're fighting? Now, based on the very threadbare information we have in this episode, it seems likely this was just two nations, or countries, or planets, or systems, whatever you want to call it, two powers who were different and had ideological or economical or military or whatever differences, and then resolved them. That's usually a situation where if you reach the point where you've made living suicide bombers, you've probably gone too far. And I mention that because it's actually kind of rare that fiction bothers to analyze that aspect of things. Too often it's the Skynet thing. Well, we made a super intelligent computer and then it killed us. And therefore that was the problem. It was the AI has decided we are the enemy, that kind of a thing. Rampancy. But very rarely do they analyze why did we do this in the first place? Why did we need something so advanced that it could be debated to be its own sentient sapient being, and we're still telling it to go off and kill and die for us? At what point are we making a slave race? That's the question that's very rarely asked, and I credit this episode for bringing it up, even though they didn't bring it up into the open. It is pretty much the undercurrent of the episode. The intelligence of the Warhead is always key on display. And if I felt like being kind, the fact that it, in absence of its primary memories, actually thought it was a person of the species that it was, it doesn't matter, we never know them, is also kind of indicative, I would think. Just food for thought. I will be talking more about the creation of AI and whatnot in a future episode with regards to the EMH. For now, I will see you guys next time.